Have you ever wondered how these little guys went from being pests to pets? I'm Ridley, and this is Radar, and together we're gonna dive into that. In this series, we're gonna be covering more than just how to bring a pet rat home and what you need to be started. Today we're gonna be starting with the domestication of the Norwegian brown rat, also who eventually became the fancy rat. Now, the term fancy has often had a lot of negative stigma from pet stores due to the fact that they often just slap that in front of an animal to make it seem more expensive or rare than it actually is. But in this case, the fancy rat is actually the proper name for the domesticated form of the Norwegian brown rat, or Norvidicus, or Radicus norvidicus domestica for the domesticated form, or just Radicus norvidicus, which is the cousin to the black rat, which is just Raditus raditus. These guys, as you can see Radar here, have come a long way from being just considered the number one pet and, plague bearers carrying fleas and other problems into early 18th century and beyond homes to animals that have been considered as friendly as a dog and as likable as a cat, and easy to maintain if you know what you're doing. Now, in this series, like I mentioned, we're going to be covering more than just the care for pets. I'm also going to be covering how to breed them properly, what to do with oops litters, and in general, just the history of the rat itself, because knowing more about your animal and where they came from helps answer a lot of questions that people may have about their animals, like certain characteristics, why they look a certain way, or why breeders do what they do. Now, we can trace these guys back to their domestication around the 18th century when, unfortunately, they didn't have the best beginnings. Now, like I mentioned, I will be covering more than just cute, friendly little rats. I'm going to be talking about their history, and unfortunately, their history isn't all that good because they were considered pests. So if you're, a little bit squeamish, you don't want to hear about these sweet little guys being used for, bad things, I would suggest just skipping this video if you don't want to hear about that. But it is going to be really, really interesting in my opinion. I love learning about history, and learning about the history of an animal is just top notch. So going over that and learning about where these guys came from, just honestly, when I was reading and writing this script, made me love them even more. So this is your warning right now. I'm not going to go into gruesome detail, but if you don't want to hear about some of the negative things that they were seeing in the 18th century, just give this video a skip and I'll see you next week. That said, let's get into it. The Norwegian brown rat came obviously from Norway. It came over to England in particular, being an island ecosystem, and quickly usurped the black rat. Now, the black rat being a little bit smaller, a lot of people say these guys, they trump their size. It's only by roughly an inch, and the black rat actually has a longer tail. So the black rat, though, is an arboreal species. Arboreal meaning that they live in trees and high up. In the wild, those would be rats that you would see in trees. The brown rat, though, is not arboreal. They like to burrow and they like to live in nests on the ground. And that does play into a key factor of caring for them as pets, because that part hasn't gone away. These guys prefer to have areas where they can dig and burrow, whether it be through hammocks, dig pits, tunnels, and stuff like that are, safe for them. They quickly were able to live in England easier due to the sewage systems and, the sewage system when they came around, as well as just the fact that most houses were low to the ground and had dirt floors, so they were able to dig in and easily make a home. They're also a little bit hardier than the black rat, weren't as susceptible to some of the poisons that they were using back then, which became a big play into their actual domestication. Now, there were two people in particular, technically there are three people who are considered the frontrunners for the fancy rat. Now, most people who are a little bit more historians when it comes to the fancy rat will know of Mary Douglas. Now, Mary Douglas is considered the mother of the fancy rat, and while that is true, she did help the fad in the 1900s get started for these guys. We really have to go back to the two rat catchers that, unfortunately, through means of just wanting money and doing their job, helped the domestication of these guys. Now, the first person is James Shaw, James Shaw, as he's often known. It was just a not really a noble, but higher up in the hierarchy in the 1800s in England. He was a known dog breeder, and with dogs back then came sports. Now, the difference between hunting sports and blood sports, hunting sports being, an actual hunt and more tracking skill needed, whereas blood sports were just that they were more violent and gruesome and were just there to show off the dog's skills in being able to kill rats, rabbits, moles, and whatnot. He focused on breeding rats mainly because he was supplying them for his own rat pits, but he wasn't really focused on their colorations and stuff like that, not as detailed as a Jack Black was. Now, Jack Black is often, you'll see his names written in quotation marks. We roughly know his last name was Black, but we don't know whether or not his actual first name was Jack, as that's just what he called himself on top of multiple other things. Jack Black called himself the Royal Rat Catcher, even though he never held an actual royal title or paperwork for it. He often donned upon himself a green top coat along with a scarlet blouse and breeches, and a sash that had a brown leather sash that had cast iron rats on it, and that was his go-to for his rat catching. Now, he'd been rat catching since he was roughly 10 years old, as quoted in Henry Mayhew's book, The London Labour and the London Poor, which is a really, really interesting book if you ever want to read it. And there's an entire section on rat catching and the domestication of these little guys. But he does focus for several pages on Jack Black, and I just dived into that book and absolutely loved it. So Jack Black talks about how he worked with not only rats but moles and other animals, and he actually talks about what he saw these animals as versus how the people around would just see them as pests. He talked about how they lived together as families, how they worked together, how you would often not see, unless they're put into extreme stressful areas, the Norwegian rat wouldn't pit against each other. And unlike the black rat, where he often talked about them being more aggressive towards each other and just aggressive in general. Now, as a rat catcher, he would, of course, go out and he would remove rats, moles, and other pest animals from storehouses, farms, and people's houses. And one thing to keep in mind as I'm going through this is that during that time period, rats were a lot more dangerous than they are today. In common day, we know more about diseases and how viruses spread, but back then in the 1800s, not as much. I mean, they were getting started, but they weren't there. And to show why, it was originally thought that the Norwegian brown rat, these little guys, were venomous. It's easy to understand where they would come from that if you've ever been bitten by one of these guys. A bite from a rat in general, or anything with incisors teeth, and incisor teeth are teeth that rats have, they go like this, and they basically cause a guillotine type of effect when they bite and sear into anything. They can bite straight to the bone on someone's finger, and they can cause extreme lasting nerve damage, which is why, people didn't want them in their houses when they were aggressive and skittish, and why breeders today still focus on that natural, sweet behavior of these guys. So back then, though, when of course didn't have the proper hygiene, didn't have the knowledge and the say of the norm that we have today, when someone got bitten by a rat, it often led to necrocy around the area, which is decaying of the flesh and the dying and your fingers turning black. And it would also turn to illness, disease, hands swelling up, and if you know anything about reptiles and snakes, that's very, very similar to when being bitten by a venomous snake. So often these guys were considered poisonous or venomous until later on, when we learn that no, they're not. They just have bacteria in their mouths like everyone else does, and if you don't clean it out, you're risking infection. So Jack Black would go out to these people's houses and he would remove them, and he would often talk about how when it came to the black rat, he would just straight up and go through and exterminate unless he found some that he could in fact catch to bring back to sell to the rat pits. Whereas when it came to the Norwegian brown rat, he saw a bit more of a means to make more money. And mind you, when I'm talking about all these guys, they were strongly money-driven. The book itself is called The London's Poor. These people weren't necessarily wealthy. Jack Black did, in the book, live a bit more, better life than, say, just a normal street person, but he still wasn't, a noble by any means. He still wasn't, living large. So he would go and he would catch rats and then sell them for about $1 to $5 a piece to rat pits. And that's how he made more money than he would make removing rats, because often removing rats was just considered a civil service back then. Think of it an exterminator. You call up an exterminator and say, hey, I have cockroaches and spiders and stuff like that. And they're like, okay, I'll come out. And they just come out. But instead of killing all of them, they just collect the cockroaches and spiders and sell them to someone else, because they know that you're most likely not going to pay them. You might tip them, might give them some food or some lunch, and recommend them to your friends, but you're not obliged to pay them. And that didn't come until later, in closer to the 19th century, in the 1900s, when exterminators were starting to actually charge for their services. So he would learn that he could often reach into burrows that had brown rats, and he could just pick them up and he could just grab them. Sure, they might be a little bit more, they're not gonna be as docile as Radar here, but they're gonna be a bit more like your skittish rat that if you'd see coming from a feeder bin or from an improper breeder. But even then, those rats, if you've had them and you know what I'm talking about, they're not necessarily aggressive. They're gonna want to more leave from you, and they're gonna try to squirm out of your hands versus bite you. And he learned that really, really fast, and he learned that he can actually profit from that by keeping these rats in particular. And the Norwegian rat has a lot of color variations that you would see in the wild. Albinos, you come across blacks, and you would come across, I believe he talked about Siamese, and he's mentioned blues, which he called just grays. So those were the colors that he himself mentioned, but not so by the names that we use them now. Like Siamese, he called them chimney sweeps. Because they had soot on their nose and soots on their butts, and they had red eyes, so they had irritation from being in a chimney, which honestly I think is really, really cute, in retrospect. And he talked about the gray ones and he talked about the black ones. So in the wild, as you can see, I switched out to very big boys who prefer to be on the same shoulder apparently versus their own shoulders. I have Bear, this big black one here, and I have Squirt. Now, Squirt here is a Dumbo agouti. As you can see, this is a brown. He is a self, so his belly is almost all brown. He does have a little bit of white. He's my baby. He is what you would have seen in the wild, minus the Dumbo ears, of course, if you had come across a Norwegian brown rat. And as you can see, I have to now have my microphone off my shirt because these guys like to climb a little bit more and just be in your arms. So in the wild, this is who you would see. You would see Squirt, and that brown color, is natural camouflage in burrows and dirt and tree foliage where they would like to hide. Now Bear here, who is the big black Dumbo here, he is considered now a common color. I often, as a breeder, have a harder time selling my black rats because people see them as common. Now, in 1850, when Henry Mayhew was interviewing Jack Black, that wasn't the case. These guys weren't common. They were rare. They were one of the colors that when Jack found one, he would keep them and he would breed them to have and sell as pets. And that's where the fancy rat got their start. So he would sell the ones that looked like Bear to rat pits because they were just common, either literally everywhere in the 1800s and the early 1900s. and they weren't anything special. Whereas bear is, he's a big black rat. In my opinion, he is very, very gorgeous. I absolutely love black rats, and as you can see, they are boggling in my arms right now. They would have kept him, and they would have bred him with another color that he would have come across, whether that be a blue or an albino, and they would have created, more. And those ones he would then go on to sell to what he called fancy and fair ladies, who would keep them in, that time were called squirrel cages. Now, squirrels were a lot more popular as pets back then. They aren't as much now. They're just easier to catch, I believe. Whereas rats were, still considered pests. These guys were, considered pests. And they would, not house them properly, unfortunately, but that was, the time difference. We know what they knew then versus what we know now as proper, these guys here, as you can see, very, very friendly, very, very nice, and this is roughly what you would see in the wild. They would be a bit more skittish, and you would have to tame them in order for them to be a bit more as pets, but as anyone who's helped a more skittish rat become tamer, you'll know that eventually most of them will turn around and be friendly to the person that, is feeding them and is being nice to them. Come on, Squirt. And was honestly something that everyone was like, well, that's different. That's not what we know. He must, have tamed these guys, and that just interests people. They were something new, something different. They weren't the vermin that were often, plaguing their houses. They weren't the black rat, which was honestly, back then, more aggressive. Now, bear, as I mentioned, would be considered a more common rat now, whereas back then, he was one of the rare colors. And that kind of like what got their start as pets were something that were considered more exotic, different, not the same thing as what everyone else had, was just something, it became a fad. And it ran for a fad for about 15 years, Jack said in, again, Henry Mayhew's book. And eventually, though, it kind of died out as having them as pets when the blood sport rat baiting was outlawed and fell out of fashion as well. Just not as much demand for rats, not as much demand for breeding them. And that eventually, that fell from, that happened around 1830, roughly, is what's quoted. They're not 100% sure since that wasn't their main goal to breed rats. Though Jack Black did continue breeding his own, simply because that's just something he enjoyed doing. He bred dogs, he bred ferrets, he bred birds, and when he came across an interesting colored rat in his work, he would breed and produce those, whether and sold them to anyone who was interested in, or just kept them as pets himself. And used them for essentially for street performances, since they were so sweet. It wasn't until 1901 where most people would know for the fancy rat and not know their history in rat baiting and rat catchers, and how they basically got started because they were nicer than the black rat, and people just found that interesting. Was Mary Douglas. Now, Mary Douglas reached out to the Mouse Association that was in England and asked if she could bring some of her rats and enter them in Best in Show. And they agreed. And surprisingly to everyone there, her black and white hooded rat won Best in Show. And that ignited a fad amongst the mouse fanciers and eventually rats fanciers to start buying rats again. And that again brought into the need for rat catchers to catch and breed more than just the normal caught brown rat. And this private breeders who had kept their rats and continued on those lines brought in, some of the newer colors. I believe fawn colors were slowly being introduced. And eventually it just kind of took off, and that really helped the fancy rat as a species in general take a hold into being a pet and considered an actual pet and not a pest, and considered that driving line between their wild cousins and the domesticated forms of them. Now, it wasn't a long-lasting fad. It ran until she died in 1929, and it didn't pick up again until 1979 when the European National Rat Association was formed. And from there and on, rats became, became more into the world that we know them now. Breeding really took off, and not from exterminators, but from actual people like me and other breeders who saw these guys and realized that they are amazing pets, and they make amazing pets, and providing those well-bred, sweet, and adorable rats who just like to be held and rocked like their babies, as you can see Bear here, to the public. And now in 2020, a couple hundred years since their start, we no longer have to outsource them or look for them from exterminators, and we no longer have to work from wild colonies and breed and work with them until they are happy, sweet little pets. We are now just lucky enough to reach out to one of the hundreds and hundreds of breeders out there and be like, hey, I'm looking for such and such color, and what's this ear placement and this coat color. Take for granted some of the more simple colors, the ones that got their roots in the 1800s, because we have so many options out there. But knowing their history, knowing where they came from, knowing the fact that a couple men who are interested in fighting them in pits and showing off how strong and good rat killers their dogs were actually the start of these sweet little guys being able to be seen as more than pests. And honestly, that's just amazing in my opinion. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I hope you have a safe Halloween. I figured that this would make a good Halloween episode, talking about something a little bit more dark about the rats themselves, and being able to be a good introduction segment into actual rat care, where you should get your rats, what they need before, and what to expect before they come home. Because as much as a lot of people like to hide and not talk about Jack Black and Jemmy Shaw, they did intentionally start breeding for sweeter and nicer rats that weren't going to bite and attack and be skittish and not want to be held and cuddled and loved on by their owners. And without that, Mary Douglas probably wouldn't have had her rat, and that probably wouldn't have gotten, the fad going in the 1900s, which led into the association being formed, which led into where we are now. So I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you look forward to my first more official video next week on what you need to prepare when bringing home a rat, what to expect, the pros and cons type of things, because I am very much for showing what to have and what's good and bad, because these guys, they aren't for everyone. I'll talk about what's going on my chest here from rats, allergies and whatnot in my next video. And you'll see more of these sweet little guys. So I'm Ridley, this is Bear, and stay safe out there.